I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. 20 and 30-somethings are flocking to San Antonio, and the nation's fastest-growing city has a new moniker no one saw coming: Millennial Magnet. I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News general assignment reporter Melissa Fletcher Stoeltje to find out more. Melissa, it's great to have you back here on the podcast. Today's topic, quite different from the very serious one we discussed the last time you joined me here. And immediately, in my mind, I want to jump to how you researched this article. How does one go about investigating San Antonio's growing millennial population? It's almost like a sitcom in my mind. I can imagine you like going to a club and trying to like interview all these young people. How did you go about doing this?
Well, I got the idea originally by there was a New York Times article a couple months ago when Julian Castro announced he was running for president. And it was about how San Antonio really is sort of the future, the political future of the nation, given our majority population. And mentioned in there was just a little sentence about how we're the second fastest growing millennial population out of the top 100 cities. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. I want to look more into that. And I learned from the Times article that there was a study that the Brookings Institution put out recently that looked at from the years 2010 to 2015 the growth of millennials across the nation and the characteristics and lots of different elements to this cohort. And so I got the study and I read it, and it was really interesting. And then I had to sort of like localize it, right? Because I wanted to write about San Antonio being the second fastest growing millennial population out of the top 100. And only Colorado Springs actually has a faster growing population. Now, of course, we don't have the most number or the highest percentage when you look at other cities like, New York or LA or Chicago or even, Dallas, Houston, or Austin, but it's fast growing. And that was so interesting to me. So the first thing I did was I knew there were a couple of companies here in town that really are very sort of millennial focused. A lot of millennials are involved. And the first one was Tech Block. So I called Tech Block and I talked to this guy named Dax Marino, who he's not a millennial. He's a little bit older than that, but I met with him and we just talked about the whole sort of, why the population is growing so fast here. What's bringing this population here? These young people are causing them to never leave if they were born here. And so I talked with him, and then he put me in touch with this other guy at Geekdom, which is the second sort of a co-working collaborative company. And I talked with Beto, who is in fact a millennial, and picked his brain about what's going on here. Why are we seeing this sort of influx of I guess hipsters, you might want to call them. And from that, I got some ideas about how to go out into the community and research it. And obviously, there's some areas of town that really are very popular with this population, like the Pearl Farmers Market or the Pearl, period. Southtown, King William. That's where we're seeing a lot of the bars, the restaurants, the festivals, the coffee shops, the bars, the food trucks. And I found out there's this little area on Broadway that's just very interesting little micro retail space with, food trucks and these silver Airstreams where millennials go there to, buy coffee and get their hair cut in a trailer and, buy unusual locally made goods. So once I figured out sort of where the areas were to go look, I just went out hunting basically. And I went and just went out a couple of times and just went up to people and said, how old are you? First of all, to see if they were between the years 23 and 38, because that's sort of the range of age. Millennials, they call them millennials because they grew up during, the early millennial days. That's kind of why they have the name.
And so that's it. It's 23 and 38. I ask because I'm a millennial. I guess now I can say for sure that I'm a card-carrying millennial, but I actually had to look it up. I'm 33. I hear the term all the time, but I was like, yeah, I think I'm a millennial.
Yeah. A lot of people I noticed when I first started reporting, there was a lot of kind of confusion around what does it actually mean. And it's really the span of years you were born from either 1981 to 96, 97, different research organizations have sort of different, you know, different times for the range, but it's basically that sort of glut that was born, early in the millennium. And there's about, gosh, 75, 78,000 so far in the nation. So this cohort is actually larger than the baby boom cohort, which I'm a part of. So there's a lot of them out there, and a lot of them are coming here to San Antonio, and that's a fact.
So you've just thrown out a lot of stuff, a lot of great information. Let's try to unpack each one of these topics a little bit more. First off, as we just mentioned, we kind of identified what a millennial is, so we're right on track, moving along here. You mentioned some of the areas where you thought this age group is really identifying, spending their time in the San Antonio metropolitan area. You talked about some of the draws. The one that stuck out was getting your haircut in a trailer. I'll have to try that. What were some of the main draws that you found in your research, or people in their 20s and 30s?
Sure, and I want to make sort of a caveat that it's really to use a broad brush to brush an entire generation. It's there's exceptions to every rule, right? But by and large, this age group is drawn and attracted to certain things. For example, they like density in where they live and play. And by that I mean where there's lots of residences close by, lots of shops, walkability, bars, restaurants, and so the downtown area is really becoming part of this sort of urban core idea. Like around the Pearl, you've seen these lofts going up, these condos. On the east side, where things are gentrifying, there's the same kind of thing happening. Same with Southtown and King William. Of course, some of these areas are pretty expensive to live in, but some aren't. And so millennials like to they don't want to live out in the suburbs. They don't want to live in sort of nondescript apartments around Loopland. They want to live in the urban core, the city center, and be around other young millennials with lots of amenities, lots of sort of chances to have good life experiences. Other studies show that millennials, more than buying things, they like experiences. They like to have sort of a very rich and textured urban life. So that's where you're seeing this sort of happen around the city center. And one thing that Dax told me that wasn't in the story is that he traces some of this back to when Julian Castro was mayor, and he announced the decade of downtown. That was a while back, but there's really this focus about getting the kind of transportation that millennials like scooters and Uber and Lyft, rental bikes, lots of urban housing, and lots of sort of things right within the area. So you don't have to get in a car and drive on the highway to go live your life, right? It's all right there around you. So that's what's kind of been growing in tandem with the millennials coming here, is this kind of lifestyle that they really, really want, at least for right now. Now, maybe when they get older and have children, they may hightail it to the suburbs, but I kind of doubt it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We'll talk about how changes with maybe this initial sort of wave that's coming in once people get older, and then once more of the wave arrives, what that might look like. We'll get back to that. But in your piece that's currently available online at expressnews.com, you wrote that, quote, San Antonio pales next to millennial powerhouses like New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles, or even Houston, Dallas, or Austin. But the trend is significant considering how this age group might affect public policy, economic growth, and the city's tone and texture in the decades to come. That last part is what I'd like to ask you about now, the city's tone and texture. So after researching this article, what are some of the ways you found this influx has affected Alamo City? You've also already talked about, maybe some of the very obvious things, transportation, the way that business has adapted to people wanting to be in, very populated areas, living, working, and also enjoying themselves. How else has this affected the city?
Sure. Well, I have to say one thing too. First, when you compare San Antonio to, say, millennial megacities like Washington or, even Houston or Austin, it's a lot more expensive to live there. The cost of living is higher. The housing costs are higher. So that's, I think, one thing that's attracting this age group here to San Antonio is they're having some of the sort of amenities and lifestyle choices that they can find here, but that it's cheaper to live here. Well, for now it is, but again, in these areas where they want to live, it's getting more and more expensive. But it's still, comparatively speaking, to these other sort of mega cities, it's a lot cheaper. And there is a growing sort of tech scene here, tech scene with like cyber tech and biotech. So the kind of jobs that these young creatives are interested in having are growing here. And it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing, right? It's like the tech scene started growing, so it's drawing these people that are creating more of a tech scene or a different kind of economic, getting away so much from sort of retail service-based industry that San Antonio is known for. And it's created this sort of right soil for like startups to start up here, whether you want to start your own company, your own restaurant, your own coffee shop. It's cheaper here. There's a little bit less competition in sort of these very sort of, hustle bustle cities like New York or even Houston. So it's a little bit more of a friendly sort of, and I'm not saying it's not competitive here, but, there's opportunity here if you're just starting out that you might not be able to do in one of these more expensive, more crowded, more hyper competitive cities.
Yeah, I would never hear, New York or Chicago being described as like a big small town, which I've heard San Antonio described
Right.
over and over again as, yeah.
I was born and raised here. I lived in Houston for 7 years, but I'm 61, so I'm, a baby boomer. And it's amazing for me to see the change, when I went out to do this story and started hanging out in some of these areas, to just see the feel of it is the vibe is so different from what I was, growing up here. San Antonio has always kind of been viewed as sort of this sort of stepsister of Texas cities. We're not, razzle dazzle like Houston and Dallas. We're not, hip like Austin. We've always been sort of this provincial sort of, little sleepy city, big city with a little town feel. But that's really changing. And I think one other important point here is I interviewed Ron Nuremberg, the mayor, and he's talking about how this cohort, they're getting into positions of leadership. People like Beto Altamirano and Dax Moreno and other people, and they want to create the things that they want. Like I said, maybe rail. We tried to get rail here in San Antonio so many times, and it just hasn't worked out. They want a diversified, or more forms of public transportation. They want more housing in the urban city center. They want more green spaces, more parks. Walkability and fitness is very important to this age group. So as more of these young people kind of trickle up into positions of authority, which it's already happening, we're going to see more of these policy issues kind of go their way because there's strength in numbers. There's power in numbers. I mean, frankly, as an older person, I'm very thrilled to see that. I'm glad to see San Antonio kind of coming into its own. And I think the millennials, who you have to say there are people that criticize millennials, right? They're entitled. They grew up, with these helicopter parents that gave them a ribbon just for showing up to soccer practice. Just from talking to the millennials, I got to know, and I gave birth to one. My son is 31 and he lives in Houston. I'm energized by these young people, and I think they have great ideas. A lot of them are very idealistic. They're very mission driven. They want to make the world a better place. They care about things like climate change and same-sex rights, reproductive rights. They're very progressive as a group. Again, as a group, not so much. There's exceptions to every rule, but I for one am very optimistic that this is happening here and it's happening now, and it's only going to continue. I don't see the tide going back, frankly.
Well, what a refreshing take on the millennial culture. It's great to hear that. We've talked about kind of the big elephant in the room a few different times. So let's just face it head on. Austin, of course, is often thought of as one of America's hippest cities, certainly in Texas. But one person you spoke to called the Texas capital overcrowded and expensive and noted that they, quote, couldn't imagine living there anymore. As noted, it kind of depends, what era you're talking about. San Antonio's getting more expensive. It seems like every other day there's a report coming out on the housing crisis and transportation issues in the San Antonio area. But maybe compared to Austin, compared to New York City, of course, I lived in New York City for a time and I would never want to live there again. So it's all.
No, I spent 3 weeks there after 9/11. I went and did some reporting up in New York, and I love New York. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a fabulous city, but I think it would be kind of hard to live there too.
Yes, we agree. The benefits of San Antonio. But yeah, to finish up here on Austin, you mentioned it a little bit ago, but I want to ask you point blank. What do you think about that sentiment, that statement about it
Right.
being overcrowded and expensive? Obviously, you might be able to say that about San Antonio here in several years. But yeah, I think there's quite a difference between the cities, at least today.
Yeah. Well, there's already people that, talk about how San Antonio is so overcrowded. My father-in-law lives in Seguin and he can't stand to come here because it's, traffic's crazy. But but and yeah, Jomando Cruz was one of the millennials that I interviewed in the story that made that statement. And he actually used to live in Austin, and I heard that actually from a number of people when I was interviewing. And I don't want to denigrate Austin. It's an amazing city. I love Austin. I love going there. But it has changed. They're kind of in the post tech boom, and it is it's very expensive and it is pretty crowded. So I think, but Austin's amazing. South by Southwest is going on right now, and it's an incredible place. But I think San Antonio, in a way, we have some of the benefits of Austin without some of the drawbacks. We're kind of in this sort of fledgling state of this millennial scene growing, so you can kind of have that millennial lifestyle without some of that kind of you know overcrowded expensiveness that you see in Austin now, the kind of sort of dog eat dog. And, somebody actually said that Austin's kind of becoming like California. There's a lot of wealth there, a lot of money. And, there's money here too, but I don't know, it's just it's different. And I don't think San Antonio um, is going to become Austin. I was talking to Dax earlier today, and he, we don't want to become another Austin, another San Francisco. We want to be San Antonio, but with these benefits and this energy and this innovation and creativity. But I don't diss Austin. I just think that that's a common thing. That a lot of people that live there, these young people, they're coming back here because they can, kind of be on the beginning part of a millennial kind of breakthrough, as opposed to being sort of just part of one that's been going on for a long time. It's that kind of excitement of getting in on the ground floor. I heard that a lot when I was talking to people that they can have the benefits of living in a relatively low cost, easy to get around city, and just have that kind of the lifestyle they want, to have that sense of density and excitement and energy.
That's a great point, and I'm glad that you made that here in the final moments before we wrap up today's episode. There's nothing quite like living in a city, or I've lived abroad a lot in my life, living in a country that's on the up and up, as I like to say, compared to one that's been growing for some time. When you can tell things are changing, and in this way, you make the case getting better. There's nothing like that feeling, and I think that's a great way to describe the difference between Austin and San Antonio. One has been on the up and up for a while, and maybe it's starting to get the consequences of that, as you just pointed out, while the other one
Right,
is
exactly.
fresher on that course.
Right, right.
I finally want to get to that topic that I teased a little bit earlier when you mentioned it, and we can spend some time on it now before we say goodbye for today's episode, Melissa. We've talked about the ways this influx of millennials has already started to affect San Antonio. You mentioned the idea of once people start to age and have kids, how that might change, but also maybe like a snowball effect. Once you have a certain critical mass of these millennials, my fellow millennials, maybe that'll have its own changes as well. So what do you think about the future and how it will affect Alamo City?
Right, right. Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but it's kind of hard to get the toothpaste back in the tube, right? And we've become, we're on the national map. The New York Times did a story about San Antonio and how we're kind of the future politically, with our demographics and this young Hispanic majority. I really can't see this going anywhere but forward, because it's once you become desirable, it's sort like I say, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that more people hear about it, they want to come here. Traditionally, historically, San Antonio has dealt with like a lot of poverty, a lot of income segregation. So there's some hurdles to overcome. The Brookings Institution study did make a point that millennials are very diverse. 44% of them nationally are people of color, and Hispanic and African American millennials. There's some gaps there in terms of things like education and income. And I know that we've seen that problem here in San Antonio with the racial disparities in graduation, college graduation, and income. But we've got people like Beto and Dax Moreno who are they're determined to bring everybody up. We have of all Texas cities, we have I don't have the exact number, but we have the Hispanic millennials are definitely the majority here. And, we want everybody here to have this prosperity, to have this excitement. So there's programs like, Project Quest and Cafe College, where we can bring everybody up in this sort of millennial peak greatness. So everybody can get a chunk of the energy and the prosperity and the fun. And so I'm very hopeful that we can, as more young people come here, those sort of traditional historical problems that we've had, things like intergenerational poverty, that can be a part of helping to overcome that, and turn the corner to where we really will be, a national city, which I think that's where we're going. And I hope I live long enough to see it.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News General Assignment reporter Melissa Fletcher Stoeltje for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.